In the heart of the Vatican, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stands defiantly before Pope Leo XIV, her Black Lives Matter crucifix gleaming under ancient stained glass. He demands its removal, not as an insult, but as a warning. For 27 blistering seconds, neither blinks. He invokes sacrifice. She unleashes history, and in a twist that no one saw coming, one of them drops to their knees, not out of reverence, but reckoning. When faith tries to silence justice, who gets to decide what holiness looks like now? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marble walls of the Apostolic Palace, beneath the vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of diplomacy and doctrine, a new kind of reckoning was about to unfold. The Vatican's private guard stood motionless, but tension crackled in the air like dry lightning. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pontiff, once a barefoot missionary in the slums of Peru, stood in silent reflection before a wooden cross worn thin by time and prayer. He had shaken hands with kings, silenced billionaires with scripture, but today was different. Today he would meet Jasmine Crockett, not just a congresswoman, not just a black woman from the South, but a storm in human form, shaped by rage, refined by injustice, and tempered by survival. She was not here for photo ops or papal platitudes. She was here carrying generations of trauma that had never once knelt in Rome. Outside, the Vatican courtyard buzzed with controlled chaos. Cameramen adjusted tripods with trembling fingers. Security whispered into sleeves. The global media was watching, but none of them could predict what was coming. Jasmine's motorcade rolled in, sleek and black, like a hearse for dead illusions. When the door opened, she stepped out not with hesitation, but with the focus of a soldier marching into hostile territory. Her heels clicked against the cobblestone like the countdown of a bomb. Her navy blue suit was sharp, tailored, and defiant, and around her neck, catching glints of morning sun, a blackened silver pendant in the shape of a raised fist. No jewels, no gold, just history, rage, and resilience. It wasn't an accessory, it was a declaration, a line drawn through centuries of silence, screamed in metal. Jasmine knew what this moment was. It wasn't about faith, it was about power, and who got to wield it in public. Ever since she entered politics, the system had tried to trim her into something palatable. Too loud, too black, too unapologetically real. She had been cut out of interviews, spoken over in hearings, warned to smile more as her colleagues stripped voting rights from her district. She had been told to remove her natural hair for professionalism, told to tone down her tone, told to understand decorum. But now, standing before one of the oldest institutions of spiritual authority, Jasmine was done being edited. Every thread of her suit carried defiance. Every breath she took reminded her of the ones lost to police knees and prison bars. She did not come as a servant. She came as an equal, or as close as the world would allow her to get. The doors closed behind Jasmine with the quiet weight of ceremony, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. She had entered many rooms like this before, places where the air felt owned, where tradition sat thick on every surface, and where her presence was both unexpected and unwanted. Yet she moved as if the room had been waiting for her all along. Her gaze swept the chamber, not with arrogance, but with clarity. She saw the lines of gold leaf molding, the columns that held up more than just stone, the crimson silk draped over chairs occupied by men who had never once lived her reality. She walked the central aisle with quiet authority, the soles of her shoes echoing over marble polished by centuries of power. Her hand briefly adjusted the pendant at her collarbone, its cool weight familiar, grounding. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a promise she wore every day, to remember the names that never made it into history books and to carry them into every space that tried to forget them. When she reached the designated spot before the altar, she stopped with perfect poise, lifted her chin slightly, and offered the expected nod of respect, measured, meaningful, but not submissive. She held that silence, waiting for protocol to respond. But nothing came. No welcome, no motion. The Pope remained motionless, his face unreadable, his presence as still as stone. Then, with eyes that seemed to weigh the meaning of her very existence, He looked not at her face, but at her neck, at the raised fist pendant, blackened silver against dark blue fabric. One beat, two, three. Then his voice broke the silence, low and blunt, cutting through centuries of ritual like a blade. Take it off! No title, no context, no invitation to dialogue. The words didn't echo. They sank. The room seemed to fold in on itself. Reporters froze behind their lenses. Aides blinked but said nothing. The grandeur of the chamber, the carvings, the relics, the saints in stained glass, offered no buffer from what had just been said. The weight of it didn't come from volume, but from history, from how many times she had been asked to make herself smaller, quieter, more convenient. And now here too, in this holy place of supposed universal compassion, her identity had once again been reduced to an object to be erased for comfort. The Pope's words, "Take it off," did not echo. They didn't need to. They landed with a finality so sharp, so exact, that the very air in the Vatican audience chamber seemed to tighten around her throat. Jasmine didn't move, not a blink, not a breath out of place. Her entire body held still, but not in deference. It was the kind of stillness a person learns when every movement is watched, judged, and prepared to be punished. She had been here before, not in Rome, not before a pope, but in rooms just like this, rooms filled with marble, with men in robes or suits, cloaked in authority that often mistook cruelty for righteousness. She had walked into this chamber bearing centuries on her shoulders, knowing full well the weight of being both black and unbowed in a place built to make people kneel. But she had not expected this, not from him, not from the man whose sermons on suffering had gone viral, the man who kissed the feet of migrants, who turned away gold vestments for cotton cloth and spoke about simplicity as if he meant it. And yet here he was, shrinking in the most predictable way, his gaze bypassing her humanity and going straight for the thing that made him uncomfortable. The pendant she wore like a wound, the fist, that tiny clenched symbol resting at the hollow of her throat. She had worn it in protests, in hearings, even beneath her congressional pin. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about memory. It was about the names she said out loud when no one else did. About Brianna, about George, about Sandra and Tamer, and Philando, and the long, unspoken list of names carved into her mind like headstones. That symbol had carried her through tear gas and Senate roll calls, through sound bites and subpoenas. And now the Pope wanted it gone. No explanation, no dialogue, just an order. The silence in the room wasn't holy. It was strategic, calculated. Everyone was watching to see how she would respond, whether she would bend, whether she would apologize for daring to bring the story of her people into this cathedral of empire. But Jasmine remained still, not out of obedience, but out of recognition. She had heard those words before. She had felt that gaze. And before her body could even process the sting of the present, her mind reached back, snapped back, to the very first time. She was 8 years old. The church in South Dallas was small, hot, and packed every Sunday with black families in their best clothes and best hopes. Jasmine remembered the smell of wood polish on the pews, the way the choir's voices bounced off the high ceilings like sunlight. That morning, her mother had taken extra care. Jasmine's hair had been freshly washed, oiled, and braided into 12 neat cornrows, each finished with a pink bead that clicked softly when she moved. It had taken hours. Her scalp still tingled, but she had smiled in the mirror, felt proud, felt pretty, felt ready. They arrived early, as always, taking their usual seats on the right side near the stained glass window of the Good Shepherd. Jasmine held her children's Bible tight against her chest. She liked this place. She liked the songs, the rhythm, the way the women said, "Amen, baby," when the pastor said something good. But halfway through the sermon, it happened. A woman in a large feathered hat leaned forward, whispered into the usher's ear, and pointed directly at Jasmine. Moments later, a man in a gray suit approached their pew. He bent down with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Sweetheart," he said, too softly to be kind, "your hair is distracting. It's not appropriate for worship." At first, Jasmine didn't understand. She thought maybe she had done something wrong. She looked at her mother, whose face had turned to stone. Her jaw clenched, Her eyes burned, but she didn't speak. The usher gestured again, firmer this time. "We're going to need you to step out, just until service is over." Jasmine was pulled gently but unmistakably from her seat, her beads clicking like tiny accusations in the hallway's quiet. She remembered the way the sun hit the church floor through the front door as it closed behind them. Her mother didn't cry. She just gripped her daughter's hand harder than usual, walked them to the car in silence, and drove away. That was the day Jasmine learned something no child should have to learn. You can love God, but still not be welcome in His house. And now, standing in the most powerful house of them all, she was being told, again, that who she was made someone else uncomfortable. Not her words, not her actions, just her presence. Just the symbol that said, "I belong to those you forget." She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her skin burned, not from shame, but from the friction of restraint. She had fought too hard to still be fighting this. She had survived too much to still be expected to disappear. Her hands remained at her sides, but she felt them wanting to rise. Not to touch the pendant, not yet, but to hold the weight of that memory, to steady herself beneath the crushing truth that even here, in the seat of global faith, the demand for conformity outweighed the invitation to grace. And still she did not move. Because she wasn't just standing there as Jasmine Crockett, member of Congress. She was standing there as the little girl with pink beads who had to walk out of a church so someone else could stay comfortable. She was standing there for every little black girl told to change her hair, her tone, her volume, her clothes, her faith. Told to take it off, tone it down, sit in the back. And even if her hands trembled, her spine did not. This was not new. This was confirmation. And that truth, silent, ancient, undeniable, filled her chest with something far heavier than air. The silence stretched long after the words had landed. But Jasmine remained rooted, not frozen, rooted, as if her body had anchored itself into the marble beneath her feet. She could feel every eye in the room, not just watching her, but waiting on her. The Vatican audience chamber, built for proclamations and ceremony, had been cracked open by something raw and unplanned. Yet she made no move, no shake of the head, no folded arms, no dramatic breath. She did what centuries of women like her had done. She held still long enough to read the room for what it truly was. This wasn't just about a necklace. It never had been. It was about permission, whether she was allowed to carry her truth into sacred space without apology. The command to take it off wasn't just directed at the metal around her neck. It was aimed at her very being. And yet, Jasmine didn't retaliate. She didn't lecture. She didn't give the chamber the outburst it was quietly bracing for. What she gave was far more devastating. A question. Her voice, when it came, was low. Not weak, but controlled. Not trembling, but honed. It had the weight of courtroom arguments and midnight vigils. The cadence of someone who had spoken truth in rooms designed to silence her. And still, it carried no venom, only precision, only pain sharpened into discipline. She lifted her gaze, steady, direct, and asked, "Your Holiness, may I ask, why?" 9 words, that's all. But in a room where everything was rehearsed, those words hit like a siren in a monastery. She didn't say them for effect. She didn't say them to trap him. She said them because she deserved an answer. Because people like her had spent centuries being told what to remove, to hide, to erase. Told they were too loud, too proud, too angry, too black, too political, too visible in places meant for reverence, but only when reverence looked white and quiet. The question stripped away every layer of pomp in the room. The gilded ceiling didn't shine as brightly. The tapestries didn't look as old. The titles and robes didn't seem as untouchable. Jasmine wasn't demanding validation. She wasn't pleading. She was simply asking for the one thing the powerful rarely expect to offer: accountability. Jasmine's question, measured, calm, piercing, hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples had reached every corner of the room, but Pope Leo XIV did not respond. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't meet the challenge head-on with theology or authority. Instead, he turned away from her. Not with arrogance, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, older, like a man walking back into a memory that had never stopped living beneath his skin. The entire chamber watched as he stepped away from her and moved slowly toward the altar. His hands, aged but steady, rested briefly on the white linen that draped the surface. And then, with reverence but no ceremony, he reached down and lifted a wooden cross. It was rough, unpolished, weathered with time. The kind of object that did not belong in a place like this. Not among marble and gilded ceilings and robes stitched with gold. The cross had knots in the grain, a slight crack along its horizontal beam, and edges that had been worn smooth by hands far rougher than his. It looked out of place. It looked alive. For a moment, he just held it. His thumb brushed across the surface, not as a gesture of display, but of remembrance. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a pontiff. It was quieter, more human. It was the voice of a man who had once listened more than he spoke. "I didn't become a priest in Rome," he said. "I became one in the back streets of Peru." He didn't look at her yet. His eyes stayed on the cross. The air in the room remained taut, waiting for whatever came next. "There was a woman," he continued slowly. "Her name is not in any book. You will never read about her. She had 4 children, a husband, a home made of mud and corrugated metal." His words were steady, but his hands tightened ever so slightly on the cross. "A storm came," he said. "It rained for 6 days. On the 7th, her hillside collapsed. Her house vanished beneath the earth. She tried to dig. With her hands, with a pot lid, with a stick. She clawed through mud until her fingers bled." He finally raised his eyes, not to the press, not to the cardinals, but to Jasmine. "She didn't save them," he said. "All of them gone. Her husband, her babies, all of it. And when I found her, she was sitting in what was left of the road, holding this." He lifted the cross slightly, just enough for everyone to see it, but his eyes stayed locked on Jasmine. "I said nothing. I had no words that could meet her pain, no scripture that could replace what was lost. I expected her to be angry, to blame, but she didn't. She held this cross out to me, put it in my hands, and she said," his voice dropped just slightly, "Don't wear it, Padre. Carry it." The words settled into the space like a final note in a requiem. "She carved it herself," he added softly. "After the storm, she had nothing, but she still made something." He turned the cross slightly in his hands, showing its imperfect edges, its raw surface. "This is not sacred because it is beautiful," he said. "It is sacred because it was born from ruin, because someone who had every reason to curse God still chose to make something for him to remember her by." The Pope stepped away from the altar now, not toward Jasmine, but toward the center of the space between them. His tone shifted, still soft, still intimate, but with the unmistakable gravity of someone asking a question he had asked himself 1,000 times. "I have worn vestments worth thousands, sat beneath frescoes worth millions, stood beside presidents, kings, actors, generals, and still, this cross, this one," he raised it slightly again, "this is the only one I have ever been afraid to hold." Now he did step closer, slowly, not as an accuser, but as a witness. "Because it is not a symbol," he said. "It is a burden. It is pain shaped into wood. It is love that survived what should have killed it." He paused just long enough for breath to become a question. "Symbols," he said, eyes fixed on Jasmine's now, "don't save people." And then, with no shift in tone, no raise in volume, just truth, spoken with the kind of stillness that cannot be rehearsed, "Sacrifice does." That was it. No explanation, no interpretation, just a line drawn between 2 lives. The Pope stood there, holding the cross, not above her, not before her, but between them, a bridge, or a choice. He wasn't asking her to renounce her symbol. He hadn't once spoken of the fist around her neck, but everything in his presence, the memory, the wood, the silence, was pressing a question she could now feel rising beneath her ribs. Was she wearing her story, or was she carrying it? No one moved. The chamber, so used to applause, to declaration, to control, had forgotten what it felt like to witness a moment without agenda. Jasmine said nothing, but her eyes never left the cross. The Pope's final words still echoed softly in the corners of the chamber, but Jasmine heard something else beneath them, a silence she knew too well. It wasn't peace. It was the silence that always followed when someone asked her to surrender something sacred under the guise of wisdom. And for a long breath, she said nothing. She just stood there, perfectly still, perfectly seen, yet once again expected to shrink for the sake of someone else's comfort. A wave moved through her, not of rage but of clarity, so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't condemned, but he had done what so many before him had done, draped holiness over erasure. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped, low, deliberate, devastating in its steadiness. "I've been told to remove things my entire life," she said. Her eyes never left his. "First it was my headscarf," she continued. "I was 12. A teacher said it made the other kids uncomfortable, that I looked too serious, like someone who didn't belong." Her words weren't angry. They were exact, cut from experience, polished by repetition. "They told me my name was too long, too difficult, so I shortened it, just to make roll call faster, just to make their mouths more comfortable." A pause. "They told me my voice was too aggressive, my hair too political, my truth too loud." Her hand lifted gently to the pendant at her chest, not as defense, but as memory. "And now, it's this," she said. "Now it's my symbol of freedom that's too much?" Her throat tightened, but her face remained composed. There was no performance here, no outrage, only the quiet strength of someone who had been asked over and over again to compromise her identity in exchange for approval, and was no longer willing to play by the rules of that transaction. "I've been reshaped so many times by systems that couldn't hold the shape of me," she said. "But this," she nodded toward the fist, the blackened silver pendant still catching the soft Vatican light. "This was never about decoration. This is a wound I wear out loud. And every time someone asks me to take it off, what they're really saying is, 'We don't want to see what made you.'" There was no applause, no gasp, just the weighted silence of a room witnessing the unspeakable finally spoken. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, but not to counter, not to calm, to listen. He placed a hand over his chest, right over the spot where the white collar met black cassock. His gesture was neither dramatic nor hollow. It was steady, intentional, and for the first time in that room, deeply personal. "You are not being asked to surrender who you are," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I am asking you, inviting you, to step deeper into what that identity is truly for." He let the silence linger, not out of hesitation but out of respect. "You have carried symbols your whole life, symbols that speak of pain, of pride, of protest. But beyond the symbol there is a burden not everyone is willing to carry." He nodded slowly, not toward the pendant, but toward her, her whole presence. "That burden," he said, "is not to be visible. It is to be transformational, not to be seen, but to be felt by those who cannot yet see." He paused once more, eyes locked with hers. "Beyond the form," he said softly, "is the act. Beyond what you defend is what you live. And in that stillness, no banners, no crowds, no chants, what passed between them was not a correction, but a reckoning. Not a demand, but an invitation. Not erasure, but a challenge to embody her truth with even more depth than before. That was the line now before her, not between compromise and defiance, but between representation and radical lived commitment. The air had shifted, not like a breeze, but like the pressure before a thunderclap. Jasmine stood in the center of the Vatican's audience chamber, where every inch of marble whispered history, where every eye, some hidden behind lenses, others behind centuries of expectation, now turned to her. Pope Leo XIV's words had been soft, almost gentle, but Jasmine heard them for what they were. Not an order, not a threat, but something more dangerous. A test of how far she was willing to go for what she believed. A test dressed as invitation. She hadn't flinched when he spoke. She had known rooms like this, rooms where silence was a weapon and stillness a trap. But this one felt different. The wound ran deeper because it came not from politics, not from media, not even from law. It came cloaked in the very language of sacrifice. It came from someone who claimed to understand. And still, he had asked. The cameras didn't click, not yet. But she could feel the press leaning in. CNN, Reuters, BBC, all waiting, all measuring her next move like it was a headline. They weren't here for meaning. They were here for a moment, for an image they could spin into submission, into surrender. They saw her as a symbol, loud, proud, polished. They wanted to catch the instant she folded. But Jasmine Crockett had never been built to fold. She had been built to carry. Her body did not tremble, but her breath slowed. The space around her narrowed. Not because she was uncertain, but because she was preparing. And in that narrowing silence, she raised her hand, not to point, not to protest, but to touch. Her fingers found the pendant. The blackened silver fist rested just below her collarbone, cool against her skin, heavier than its size should allow. For years it had been her armor, not flashy, not adorned, just shaped by history. It had marched through Ferguson. It had sat silently beneath Senate lapels. It had been with her in courtrooms, in churches, on the floor of the House. It had caught her tears when cameras weren't looking. It had warmed under her skin as she whispered names no one remembered anymore. And now she was being asked to let it go. Her thumb traced its edge slowly, as though remembering every person who had never been allowed to enter a room like this, who never would. She thought of her great-grandmother, born in a shack with no birth certificate, of her uncle beaten by police for fitting a description, of her mentor who died fighting for a housing bill no one ever passed, of the girls who'd been expelled for braids, of the mothers who'd been silenced in custody hearings, of the names that never made the news but lived on in the quiet thunder of her resolve. She thought of them all, and she breathed, one long, deliberate exhale, not to let go, to let in. To let in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a form of faith deeper than form itself. Then without ceremony, without speech, she unfastened the clasp at the back of her neck. Her movements were steady. She didn't hesitate. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't soften. The cameras began to flicker again, flashes like static in the corner of her vision. But she didn't look at them. She didn't perform. She just took the chain in her hand, lowered it slowly, and stepped forward. The altar was only a few feet away, but the walk felt longer. It always did when you were crossing between who you'd always been and who you might need to become. When she reached the linen-draped surface, she paused, not to reconsider, but to make sure her hands were steady. Then, with the same care she would give to laying flowers on a grave, she placed the pendant onto the cloth. The metal made a soft sound, a click, barely audible but final. Not a surrender, a statement. She stepped back, just one pace. Her spine remained tall, her face unreadable. The silence behind her, reporters, cardinals, aides, tightened into expectation, but she didn't turn toward them. She turned toward him. Pope Leo XIV stood unmoving, the wooden cross still in his hand, the lines of his face unreadable. His eyes were watching her, but not in judgment, not even in curiosity, in recognition. As if for the first time he was not seeing a politician or a symbol, but something else entirely. Jasmine met his gaze and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that cracked the air. "If I take this off," she said, "then Your Holiness, will you kneel with me?" There was no challenge in her voice, only conviction, only history. She continued, her eyes never leaving his. "Not for me, not for spectacle, not for this room, but for the people no one remembers, for the names that were never spoken in rooms like this." Her tone did not rise, but it deepened. For the children who died unnamed, for the mothers who were buried twice, once in earth and again in silence, for the men who were shackled in one century and erased in the next. She took another breath. Each word she spoke did not ask permission. Each word came from beneath generations of denial. "Kneel with me," she said, "not for performance, not to bless what is easy, but to grieve what has been forgotten, to stand, by choosing to fall, to your knees. The room was utterly still. Reporters stopped writing. Cameras stopped flashing. Even the aides and clergy along the walls lowered their eyes, not out of shame, but because something sacred had passed between these two figures. A reckoning that cut deeper than politics, deeper than religion. Jasmine stood, the altar between them, her chest rising and falling, not with exhaustion, but with release. She had not backed down. She had not yielded. She had redefined the terms of the room. She hadn't removed the pendant because she was told to. She had removed it to reveal something more dangerous than protest, a question that demanded action, not from her, from him, and now all that remained was the answer. And in that moment, silence became a character in the room, thick, present, undeniable. The Pope gave a slow, deliberate nod. Jasmine, without hesitation, mirrored it. No words, just gravity. The chamber no longer felt like a room. It felt like the center of something ancient and trembling. Marble, centuries old, reflected no spotlight now. The overhead light dimmed into shadows that seemed to lean in. As the Pope moved, the silence deepened. Not ceremonial, sacred. He turned to face the altar, his steps slow but grounded, like a man walking towards something weightier than tradition. And there it lay, her pendant, the Black Lives Matter fist, placed beside the rugged wooden cross of a Peruvian widow's loss. No guard stood behind them now. No protocol dictated the next move. All the power in the world rested not in a crown, not in a staff, but in a decision made without coercion. Jasmine watched him kneel. His white robes brushed the stone. The sound of his knee touching the ground was barely audible, but in her chest it thundered. Jasmine followed, her body lowered, slow and deliberate, not out of defeat but out of defiance to a different kind of pride. The pride that shouts when silence is needed. Her knees met the stone floor, cold and unpolished. But she didn't flinch. She had knelt on harder ground before, in protest lines outside courthouses, in cemeteries holding mothers who'd buried sons, on city sidewalks stained with names written in candlelight. This was different. This was not confrontation. This was communion. For a long moment, there were no voices, no Latin prayers, no grand pronouncements. Just the sound of two people breathing, one old, one young, one robed in papal white, the other in congressional navy. Two worlds kneeling beside two symbols, beneath one brutal truth. The world forgets its wounded. And then the whisper came, not from her, from him. May we have the courage, the Pope said, his voice barely threading through the stillness, to live our faith, even when it earns us nothing. The words caught in Jasmine's throat, not because she disagreed, but because they named the cost she'd paid her whole life. She had always been bold, visible, impossible to ignore. Her identity was her resistance. But now, here, the silence asked something else of her, not less passion, but more depth. She looked down at the cross, splintered, aged, forgotten-looking, and then at the pendant she had placed beside it. The difference between the two was not belief, it was time. One was made of metal and rage, the other of wood and grief, both sacred, both real. But only one had been passed hand to hand in a village where no cameras ever arrived. Only one had been given by a woman who lost everything and asked for no audience in return. Jasmine closed her eyes, and into that darkness, memory crept in. Her first protest at 14, standing in front of a police station with her mother. Her law school graduation, where no one said her name right, even on the stage. Her first speech in Congress, ignored by half the room. The late nights reading civil rights case files, feeling every scar not in her skin, but in her voice. And now this moment, kneeling not to give up the fight, but to recognize its sacred weight. The Pope hadn't told her to remove her identity. He had shown her what it meant to carry something ancient without spectacle. She felt a tear, not of surrender, but of understanding, the kind that comes when a warrior lays down the shield, not to retreat, but to go deeper than the battle line, deeper than applause, deeper than performance. into the part of justice that has no audience. And that perhaps was the point. The world had always told her that if she wasn't loud, she'd disappear. But here, kneeling, she realized something terrifying and liberating. You don't have to be seen to be faithful. You don't have to be loud to be lasting. You don't have to win the crowd to honor the truth. Her lips parted, and in a voice that trembled only because it was real, she whispered, "Let it not be for cameras, but for conscience." The Pope didn't respond. He didn't need to. He bowed his head lower. Jasmine did the same. No one stood first. No one ended it. And in that stillness, beneath history, beneath dogma, beneath centuries of division, something holy unfolded. Not victory, not conversion, but reverence. Two souls kneeling beside two symbols, not erasing difference, but holding it in silence and calling it sacred. And when the echo of their silent prayer faded into the stones, it didn't end there. Because somewhere, across oceans, through firewalls, beyond borders, the world was already watching what came next. The photo leaked within 7 minutes. No press conference, no official Vatican caption, no context, just an image. Jasmine Crockett kneeling at the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, her BLM pendant, heavy, unapologetic, placed beside a jagged wooden cross. No speeches, just raw defiance and humility captured in a single frame. It struck the internet like a match in dry grass. Twitter didn't even wait for analysis. It combusted. Some called it betrayal, others called it revelation. Under the weight of opinion, the divide widened by the second. Screens lit up from Ferguson to Florence, from Brooklyn to Bogota. Commentators, clergy, influencers, everyone rushed to interpret what had no caption. News anchors stitched together rushed panels. Digital theologians debated its orthodoxy. Political pundits dissected her silence like it was a soundbite. But none of them had been in the room when the silence fell. In South Carolina, a conservative columnist labeled it a calculated stunt to soften her radical brand. In Portland, an activist live-streamed in tears. "She left us," just like the others who get too close to power. In Dallas, where Jasmine first marched at 12, a muralist added a crack through her painted likeness. But then, cutting through the frenzy, came a voice no one expected. Reverend Elijah Moore, 68 years old, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist South in Atlanta, didn't log on to TikTok. He walked into his church, pulled his mic off its stand, and looked straight into the congregation like a man with no need for algorithms. His voice was hoarse, the way age and righteousness often sound when braided together. "I saw what she did," he said, "and I'll tell you what I saw." He paused. "I didn't see surrender. I saw evolution." A long silence. She didn't walk away from the fire. She walked through it without the applause. She didn't bow to a man. She bent with the weight of legacy. And then he looked up, eyes misting but steel in tone. She went further than anger. She found purpose. That clip, all 2 minutes of it, hit the internet hours after the first backlash wave and shifted something tectonic. No trending caption, no slick production, just a man's voice, honest and grave, cutting through the noise like gospel through gunfire. And the streets listened. Still, the storm was far from over, because with every hour came a new verdict. She's been co-opted. She compromised. She matured. She transcended. She forgot us. She carried us. Black Twitter fractured like tectonic plates. Some said she'd been lured into the Vatican's ancient machinery. Others said she cracked it open from inside. A former protest leader from Oakland wrote a blog titled "The Difference Between Silence and Surrender." It went viral. In it, he wrote, "The movement has always been more than marching. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is kneel without cameras and still mean it." But the attacks kept coming. Memes mocked her gesture, comparing it to celebrities who apologized for past tweets. Anonymous accounts posted photos of her with previous protest signs, one labeled "unapologetically angry," asking, "Where's that Jasmine now?" Even allies felt confused. One former staffer texted another, "Did we just lose her? Or did she just become what we were fighting for?" In Washington, D.C., the silence of lawmakers was deafening. Not one official statement, Not one resolution of praise or censure. They were all waiting to see which way the crowd moved. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. No tweets, no threads, no interviews. Instead, the only response came from a brief press inquiry when a reporter shouted across a Senate corridor, "Ms. Crockett, do you regret the gesture?" She turned only briefly and replied, calm and precise, "Not everything sacred needs explaining." The video lasted 5 seconds. It hit 1.2 million views in 3 hours, and the world still debated. But somewhere deeper, in small corners of the world where symbols cost more than votes, the gesture landed differently. In Uganda, a girls' school held a moment of silence. Their chapel hung both the cross and a printed image of Jasmine's pendant side by side. No explanation, just solidarity. In a prison chapel in Louisiana, a chaplain showed inmates the image and asked, "What would it take for you to lay something down and still walk away stronger?" In Harlem, an elderly woman lit a candle outside a shut-down church. She placed a handwritten note at its base. It read, "She didn't kneel to a man. She knelt to a memory." And in Florence, Italy, of all places, a nun painted the moment in oil. Jasmine kneeling, eyes closed, shadowed by stained glass light. She titled it, "Dignity Unscripted." Through it all, Jasmine remained out of sight. But what she started, what that single motion cracked open, was now beyond her hands. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't shouting louder. It's choosing how to be still. The return flight from Rome had been silent. No entourage, no headlines. Just Jasmine Crockett, seated by the window, staring into the dark curve of the Atlantic. She didn't sleep. She didn't even close her eyes. Something far older than exhaustion had settled in her bones. Like she'd carried not just a wooden cross from the Vatican, but the weight of every voice that never made it into the halls of power. She replayed the encounter with the Pope in her mind, not because she doubted what she did, but because she needed to rehearse it. Like a scar you keep touching, not to reopen it, but to remind yourself it's real. She hadn't removed the Black Lives Matter pendant in shame. She had placed it on the altar to demand something more sacred than symbolism, and now she was returning home, not to soften her message, but to deepen it. 3 weeks later, Justice Through Grace was born. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a think tank. It was a movement without billboards, without donors, without slogans. A series of intimate town halls in neighborhoods scarred by over-policing and under-listening. Legal clinics run out of church basements. Restorative justice circles held beside prison walls and school gymnasiums. It was messy, unpolished, and deliberately spiritual in a way that made both Washington elites and media strategists uncomfortable. The premise was simple. The fight for justice didn't end in the courtroom, and it didn't begin there either. It began in the soul, and it had to heal there too. But not everyone understood, and not everyone wanted to. On a sharp Thursday morning in March, Jasmine stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Community Reintegration and Criminal Sentencing Reform. The hearing was meant to be routine until she made it unforgettable. She had just finished laying out her plan to partner public defenders with faith-based organizations to reduce recidivism rates when the attack came. Senator Wickham, an old political relic from Arizona, leaned forward with a half smile that reeked of contempt, polished by decades of unchecked power. "Congresswoman Crockett," he drawled, tapping a pen against his gold watch, "if I wanted to hear a sermon, I'd go to church. What we need is data, not doctrine." There it was, a cold, calculated dismissal meant to reframe her as emotional, as irrational, as unprofessional. A black woman with too much conviction, too much soul for a room allergic to both. The comment was aimed not just to silence her, but to define her. And for a split second, even the cameras tilted forward, as if sensing a public unraveling. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She reached into the inner lining of her blazer. Her fingers brushed the rough edge of something ancient, something not made for display, but for memory. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out the wooden crucifix the Pope had placed in her hands. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't dramatic. It was chipped in one corner, still bearing the faint scent of desert soil and candle smoke. She placed it quietly on the microphone stand. The entire chamber seemed to lean closer. I'm not preaching, she said, eyes fixed not on the senator, but on the symbol between them. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't crack. It didn't need to. I'm remembering. The silence swallowed the room. I remember what it's like, she continued, to be 13 years old and told my natural hair was too distracting for a public school. To be 23 and stopped for a broken taillight that didn't exist. To be 30 and still explaining why grief isn't the same as anger. 1 heartbeat. 2. This, she gestured softly toward the cross, was given to me not to wear, but to carry. It was carved by a woman who lost her husband and 2 sons to a drug war not of her making. She told me, don't let this become decoration. Let it remind you that justice should cost something. And it has. A murmur rose from the back of the room, but she wasn't finished. You want data? She said, turning back to the senator. 71% of incarcerated people in this country were once suspended from school. That's not just policy, that's trauma. And if we don't treat it with the full weight of humanity, including faith, forgiveness, and dignity, then we're not solving problems. We're just moving pain around. By now, even the aides had stopped typing. Jasmine stepped back slightly, letting the crucifix catch the light, not for the cameras, but for every person watching who had ever been told to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's version of civility. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to make justice real. And real justice doesn't whisper. It remembers. It weeps. It stands in the street and still shows up to the hearing. A moment passed, then another. And then for the first time that day, Senator Wickham had nothing to say, not because he was convinced, but because for once he couldn't reframe what was real. The sunlight in Houston was different. It didn't stream through stained glass or bounce off marble floors. It pushed in through blinds and landed quietly on an old oak desk, chipped at the corners like someone had tried to erase history with their fists. Jasmine sat there, pen trembling slightly between her fingers, her spine upright but her spirit caught between the weight of the moment and the freedom she had found. The room was still. No cameras, no applause. Just the scratching of ink on paper and the slow rhythm of her breath as she wrote to the only man who had dared to meet her defiance not with condemnation, but with a question that forced her to go deeper. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. This wasn't a political statement. It wasn't a press release. It was a thank you. And in every stroke, there was something raw. Your Holiness, you did not strip me of my symbol. You gave it flesh. You taught me to carry it, not like armor to repel the world, but like a wound that can't lie. She paused, eyes burning but dry. Then the final sentence emerged, almost as a whisper. You didn't ask me to surrender. You asked me to live the symbol until it breathes. She folded the letter slowly, as if sealing something sacred. No fanfare followed. No aides rushed in. She stood, grabbed the simple wooden cross from the shelf beside her, and walked out without her security detail. Just Jasmine and the weight of what she had learned. Blocks away, a forgotten chapel sat between a laundromat and a liquor store, its paint peeling, its signs sun-bleached into illegibility. Most drove past it, but Jasmine didn't. She pushed open the creaking door, stepped inside, and let the silence meet her like an old friend. The altar was bare. No gilded relics, no booming organs, just splinters of light falling on dust. She walked forward, each step echoing louder than the last, and placed the cross down, not on a velvet cloth, but directly onto the floor. She didn't kneel to be seen. She didn't pray to be heard. She simply crouched beside it, sleeves rolled up, and pulled a basket of food and toiletries from her bag. Then another, and another. An hour passed, then 2. Children from the shelter next door wandered in. A woman with a black eye asked for help reading a form. Jasmine sat beside her and filled it out. No titles, no sermons, just hands doing what mouths could never finish. And outside, as dusk folded over Houston, someone snapped a photo through the cracked window. A congresswoman, a wooden cross, and a moment that wasn't meant to be captured. It was meant to be lived. The camera never captured what Jasmine whispered in that old church, but the echo of her presence lingered in every dusty corner, as if justice had finally traded its megaphone for a heartbeat. And from that silence, a human truth emerged, uncomfortable, raw, and impossible to look away from. There are moments when the world demands a symbol, a soundbite, a spectacle. But what it actually needs, what it forgets to ask for, is someone who will bleed quietly and keep walking. Jasmine learned that lesson, not on a grand stage, but on her knees beside the forgotten. And in that stillness, she understood. Justice was not the roar of the crowd, nor the clash of ideologies. It was showing up when no one was watching. When she laid her necklace on the altar, the world screamed betrayal. But what they didn't see was that she hadn't abandoned the fight. She had changed its form, from fire to light, from shouting to listening, from symbol to sacrifice. For years, Jasmine had been told that power comes from volume, that the louder you speak, the more righteous you must be. But now she saw it clearly. Real power was not in the volume, it was in the cost. Every scar she carried had become a line in a sacred text that no one ever bothered to read. And when the world labeled her too loud, too black, too angry, they were simply terrified of what a woman looked like when she no longer needed their permission to exist fully. The tragedy wasn't that she'd been silenced. It was that for so long they thought that was possible. She remembered being 8 years old, hair braided tight, escorted out of church because her hair was inappropriate. That day they tried to tell her that faith had a dress code. Now, decades later, another church tried to tell her that justice had one too. And yet, this time, she didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood, because she realized she'd never been fighting to be included. She'd been fighting to expand the table, to tear down the velvet ropes around truth. The cross she carried now wasn't made of gold. It didn't shine under cameras or match her outfit. It was splintered, heavy, and real. It smelled like the hands of the woman in Peru who carved it. It felt like the floor of a prison cell in Dallas. It whispered every name lost in silence. Tamir, Brianna, Sandra, and she didn't wear it for approval. She bore it because it reminded her of what change really costs, and of why so few are willing to pay it. In the months that followed, reporters tried to dissect her gesture. Politicians tried to twist it into weakness. Activists either praised her or cursed her. But Jasmine stayed still, because she'd learned that when your spine is built from truth, you don't need the world to applaud you. You just need to keep moving. She spoke less in interviews but more in action. She showed up in churches with no denominations, in courthouses with no press, and whispered faith into places that had been abandoned by it long ago. One night, a young girl approached her at a food bank. She couldn't have been more than 9, hair in tight braids, quiet, watching. When Jasmine knelt to hand her a box, the girl didn't say thank you. She just touched the wooden cross around Jasmine's neck and whispered, "Does it hurt?" Jasmine smiled, not with pity, but recognition. "Only when I forget why I'm carrying it." The girl nodded, took the box, and disappeared into the cold night. And Jasmine stood there shivering, but warm in her conviction. She had just handed off her most important sermon without saying a word. In a world obsessed with winning arguments, Jasmine had chosen to win people, not with slogans, not with debates, but with presence, with sacrifice, with the radical act of refusing to harden. And it cost her. She was mocked, misquoted, misunderstood. But she was no longer afraid, because she knew. Some revolutions are not televised. They are passed hand to hand, soul to soul, in the quiet corners of a broken world. The human lesson was never about the necklace. It was about the invisible chains we carry long after the visible ones are gone. It was about unlearning the lie that power is domination and relearning that true authority is earned, not given. Jasmine hadn't abandoned the movement. She had baptized it, in dirt, in prayer, in silence. And in doing so, she reminded a cynical world that grace is not weakness. It is warfare of the highest order. In the final chapter of her journey, Jasmine stood once more before Congress. The same walls, the same glares. A senator leaned forward, trying to provoke her. "Miss Crockett, are you here to preach or to legislate?" She didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the same wooden cross, and laid it flat on the table. "Neither," she said. "I'm here to remember the weight. Silence followed. Not out of fear, but out of something rarer, respect. And when she walked out of that room, head high and step sure, the cameras finally followed. But they were too late. The story wasn't in the hallway. It had happened long ago, in the room with no light, no stage, no applause. Just a woman, a question, and the courage to answer it with her life. The world didn't change in a courtroom. It didn't change in the Vatican. It didn't change in a viral video or a trending hashtag. It changed in a breath. A single, quiet, defiant breath. A pause before action, a calm before justice. And now the world is holding its breath again, watching, waiting for someone else to go first. But what if it's you? What if change doesn't need a stage, a microphone, or a robe? What if all it needs is the one person who refuses to pretend everything is fine? Because the real courtroom is not marble and mahogany. It's your neighborhood school board meeting where a teenage girl's hair is labeled a disruption. It's the bus stop where an old man is searched 3 times because his skin doesn't match the zip code. It's the hospital that charges double because someone doesn't speak the language of insurance. The injustice Jasmine faced wasn't unique. It was familiar. It was systemic. It was ours. She was told to take off a symbol of her freedom to be accepted in the house of holiness, and in return she asked the most dangerous question. Will you kneel with me for the forgotten? That wasn't theater. That was theology in action. That was protest without screaming, courage without spectacle. That was a woman redefining what power looks like. And now it's your turn. Will you carry your own wooden cross, not made of polished gold, but of silent burdens? The ones no one thanks you for bearing? Will you kneel, not in shame, but in clarity, for the child failed by the system you fund? Will you stand, not for attention, but for those who were told to sit down their whole lives? Because justice doesn't come with a jingle or a speech. It comes with hard choices, sleepless nights, and uncomfortable conversations at family dinners. It comes when you vote out a judge no one else even researched. It comes when you back a bill no lobbyist paid for. It comes when you tell your pastor that silence is not neutrality, it's compliance. It comes when you stop asking, "What can I do?" and start asking, "What am I willing to lose?" Because Jasmine didn't win by being loud. She won by being unshakably clear. She didn't demand applause. She demanded alignment. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for partnership. And she made the most sacred halls in the world kneel, not to her, but to the truth they had forgotten. The question now is not whether you agree with her. It's whether you're ready to act like she did. Not someday, not when it's safe, but now. Because your silence has weight, your indifference has cost. And every time you scroll past a story like hers and think, wow, someone should do something, that someone is you. It's the teacher who puts Black history on the syllabus, even when the board tells her not to. It's the pastor who trades in comfort for confrontation, because Jesus flipped tables too. It's the nurse who files the report, the lawyer who offers pro bono time, the student who stays after class to question a policy that fails her peers. That's the revolution, not riots, but resistance wrapped in responsibility. This is not a movie. There's no soundtrack, no climactic ending, no credits rolling over your moral dilemma. There's just this moment, this breath, this decision. Do you go back to comfort, or do you go forward into the fire? Because the fire refines, the fire reveals, the fire is where you find out who you really are. And if you've ever said, I would have marched with them, then march now. If you've ever whispered, I would have spoken up, then speak now. If you've ever thought, I would have never let that happen, then stop it now. Because the badge of honor doesn't come from being right. It comes from being ready. Ready to lose a friend to keep your integrity. Ready to confront your boss to protect someone else's job. Ready to sacrifice the invitation to stand with the invisible. You want to honor Jasmine? Don't repost her. Repeat her. Repeat her boldness in rooms that reward compliance. Repeat her clarity in systems that thrive on confusion. Repeat her refusal to choose between faith and freedom, between heritage and hope, between anger and action. Because she didn't throw away her symbol. She activated it. She didn't burn down a system. She exposed its cracks with precision. She didn't wait for permission. She showed what it meant to walk through the storm holding the very thing they told her to drop. And now it's your hands that are empty. So pick something up, a cause, a truth, a name, a burden, and carry it, not because it's your job, but because it's your turn. The Pope is not kneeling today. Jasmine is not testifying today. You are. What will you say when they ask where you were? What will you do when the courtroom isn't on TV, but in your own neighborhood? What will you carry when no one else volunteers? Because if Jasmine taught us anything, it's this. You don't change the world by shouting louder. You change it by kneeling lower, walking further, listening deeper, and never ever mistaking peace for justice. So go. Your silence will not save you, but your courage just might save someone else. This is your summons, not from a judge, not from a priest, but from the part of you that refuses to look away. The trial is every day now, and the verdict is up to you. And when the crowd disperses and the headlines fade, what remains is the choice you made in the quiet. Not the applause, not the outrage, just the truth. That in a world addicted to performance, you chose presence. You showed up, not perfectly, but fully. You walked into rooms that didn't want you. You stayed at tables where your voice trembled, but spoke anyway. You prayed not for ease, but for endurance. Because justice isn't a destination, it's a direction. And every small act, every private stand, every unseen sacrifice, that's the real revolution. Jasmine didn't just carry a wooden cross, she carried a question. Will you? Now the cross is in your hands, it's splintered, it's heavy, it's real, and it's waiting. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.